Welcome to another segment of our Europe section of 2021 Risks and Trends. In this panel, we will be talking to Mr. Alexander Stubb, currently the director and professor of the School of Transnational Governance at the European University Institute. Also, Mr. Konrad Szymański, witam serdecznie, Minister for European Affairs in Poland since 2015, previously also member of the European Parliament. Witam serdecznie, thank you very much for being with us. I would like to start by taking a little bit stock of what happened in 2020. For many of us, forever 2020 will be associated with the pandemic. However, from a European perspective, 2020 was a year of fundamental change in many different ways. We had the European Green Deal, which marks a watershed moment in how European Union thinks about its industrial policy, in how it thinks about its transformative role in European economies. We had Brexit on the 1st of February 2020, which is the first time that a member state of the European Union has left. And it has marked a new opening in how European Union positions itself towards its partners in the world. Finally, we had the geopolitics shift. The changing winds in the US and the changing relations globally between China, US and other big actors has made this year for the European Union a year of unprecedented challenges. Now, at the same time, Europe has fundamentally changed, you can argue, in this year. We had new budget approved, which is almost twice as big as the one we had before. New debt will be issued, which will be issued at an unprecedented scale, and how it will be paid back is still to be determined. We had unprecedented coordination when it comes to coronavirus pandemic fight response. We had new forms of cooperation being developed, in particular the vaccination strategy. Now, what I wonder when I look at these transformations of the European Union is whether these changes will stick or whether they will be temporary, whether they will disappear, and whether this is a moment where the transformation of Europe is really pushing integration forward, or whether, in fact, it risks disintegrating. Have we gone too far too quickly? This is the question that I would like to pose to our panelists in the first place. Mr. Stubb, what's your take? What's your diagnosis?
Well, I think the starting point is very simple. We human beings have a tendency to do three things. Number one, we over-rationalize the past. So we draw parallels from the past to today, which really are not linked. Secondly, we have a tendency to over-dramatize the present. I'm not saying that you just over-dramatized it, but there was a lot of unprecedented language in what you just said. And finally, we have a tendency to underestimate the future. I'm much more relaxed, sometimes even a little bit agnostic about the way in which the European Union develops. I think there is quite often a functional spillover effect. So integration in one area leads to pressure to integrate in another one. At the same time, I am the first one to admit, as pro-European as I am, that the European Union is never going to be perfect and was never perfect. By that, I mean that we advance always in three stages. Stage number one is a crisis. Stage number two is chaos. And stage number three is a suboptimal solution. I can sit here on the margins of the development of European integration, eat a little bit popcorn and make commentary and enjoy it, but it's Konrad who sits in the middle of it and tries to sort it all out.
So that's a perfect transition. Panie Ministrze, what's your take? What's your diagnosis on Of
course, it is true that not only human being and European Union is imperfect, but the whole world is imperfect, and this is our experience. I like this skeptical take, but it shouldn't lead us to over-optimistic and passive approach to the future, because future is still unknown, unpredictable, and risky for the Union. Of course, I would agree that it's worth doing our best to preserve integration. That's why I'm worried, not satisfied, or I'm not ready to buy popcorn and see passively what's going on. It could be interesting, but also very negative. I would say that we should remember that we could create quite an answer to the pandemic crisis, especially in economic terms, with the instruments we already have on hands. So the adjustments, the treaty change at the moment isn't the most urgent thing. Although, of course, Warsaw, since Brexit, was pretty open to discuss it. We invited all capitals to talk about fundamental change of the Union, because Brexit is a warning. Brexit shouldn't be understood as an accidental thing. I think the mechanism which pushed Britain outside EU are present in many member states. Maybe the scale is different, but the nature of the mechanism is the same. We saw it very clearly during the budgetary debate, where we could notice that in many capitals, EU is only about costs. That the benefits of integration, especially benefits coming from the single market, are almost unknown and absent in the public debate. That's why this sort of budgetary populism pushed even most pro-European governments in frugal countries to the position where we had a real problem in the middle of pandemic, with triggering the right relevant answer to the economic consequences of pandemic. It worries me a lot, because I have no doubt about the intention of the frugals, but I see the political context, which is evolving in a very negative way, and I think we have to confront it, because in the same time the benefits of common market in average are 10 times higher than the so-called national contributions, and the national contributions consumed 99% of our attention when we talk about EU budget, and in the end we have crises like this. I think we have to do something with this, because otherwise we will lose other countries. And of course there is a risk that some interpretations of at least interpretations of all what happened last year could trigger even more hostility to the Union, because the induction could create a negative backlash. So we have to be very careful about language. We have to be very careful what we promise. And we should be aware that the situation of the Union for the nearest future is unpredictable.
I agree with Konrad that we have to be very careful with our language. And I do think that a lot about the public discourse on the European Union at the moment is about communication. I think the catch-22 situation, not only in Warsaw, but in every European capital, is that it's very difficult for democratically elected leaders to give any credit to Brussels for whatever it does. So in my experience, when I was foreign minister, finance minister, and prime minister, quite often what you would do, if something went wrong, you would blame Brussels. If something turned out good, you would take the credit. And I think that's a situation we're going to have in the pandemic as well. So basically, we're going to end up in a situation whereby, if the Commission eventually succeeds in the vaccine rollout, it is not going to get the credit. The credit is going to go to the capitals. If it fails in the vaccine rollout, then it is going to get the blame. So this is the big problem that we have. It's very difficult to fall in love with the internal market,
But you touched upon the vaccine strategy, which I think it's such a perfect example of complexity and confusion in Europe. For the first time, we have, but at the same time, it's breaking new ground. You said I used too much the word precedent at the beginning, but it's quite clear that the European Commission negotiating on behalf of 27 member states is something that we have never done before.
Well, yes and no. I mean, remember that the European Union, in other words, the European Commission, has exclusive competence in 5 areas. One of those 5 areas is trade. So any big trade deal around the world, whether it's with Canada, with the United States, with Mercosur, or within the WTO, it is negotiated by the European Commission. Also remember that the European Commission has exclusive competence in competition policy, in other words, antitrust, the way in which companies around the world, whether they are Apple, whether they are Amazon, or whether they are Google, they have to abide by the rules negotiated by the European Commission. So it's not unprecedented. What is unprecedented is that they're negotiating in the middle of a pandemic in an area that it has not negotiated in before. And my point is here that I think it's extremely good that the European Commission is doing it. And I'll say it for 2 reasons. Number one, was it not the Commission doing the big deals with the pharmaceuticals, we would be involved in some kind of vaccine nationalism and vaccine wars. So Konrad and I would be going back and forth saying, la, 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 we got more doses than you did. Secondly, I come from a small country, 5.5 million people. Do you seriously think that AstraZeneca or any other pharmaceutical company would be interested in negotiating scale with us? No. What would have happened was that both Germany and France would have gotten the big doses, and then they, at their own prerogative, would have perhaps given us a little bit of it. So I'm glad the Commission is doing it, even though it's not currently communicating it very well, I must admit.
That's one of shortcomings, definitely. Mr. Szymański, what's your take on this particular issue? Where does the Polish government also stand on this question of vaccine strategy and cooperation between the European Commission and member states?
I think it is right to say that an alternative to common purchases of the vaccine could be more harmful than the situation we have right now. But in the same time, if you take the responsibility for the process like the European Commission did, you have to be prepared and ready to accept also criticism. And I think the criticism is not concentrated on the purchases, but the effective execution of the contracts. It is not only responsibility of the European Commission, but this is how it works. If you go to the stage and want to take responsibility and power, then you have to face accountability. And it's true, it's not always very fair. That's the nature of politics. But the European Union shouldn't expect and shouldn't demand immunity from the right to critic. We all know how it works as a public figures now or before. We are sometimes disappointed by the way public opinion judge our deeds and misgivings and omissions. It is not always just, definitely. But that's nature. And sometimes I see in Brussels the intention, the demand even, that if you want to be a proper European, you have to be silent. It's not the best way to manage the crisis. And in the case of vaccine, I think the purchases was a good decision, but the rollout is a problem, and we have to be sincere between us.
So where is the...
And you know what? I fully agree with Konrad on that. You know, with power comes responsibility, and you know, this particular pandemic, this particular negotiation on the vaccine is simply too big to fail. And I think that the Commission has to sustain, has to be able to absorb and tolerate a certain level of criticism coming from the member states, coming from an open and free media. That's in the nature of things. And I've been saying, and I've also been quite critical about the way in which the Commission has dealt with this. For instance, I thought it was a grave mistake to start talking about export restrictions last week. I'm glad the Commission withdrew its proposal. But the only way in which the Commission can now prove itself is, number one, to negotiate better deals with the big pharmaceuticals, and number two, to get the assembly line of rolling out the vaccine doses correct. But it's an uphill battle, and they have to do it, and they have to prove it.
I wondered a little bit about the risks of these export restrictions, because you have what the Commission changed now is the reference to the Irish Protocol. So we still have a form of export restriction that is possible. And is it not that the European Union, which places itself as a defender of multilateralism, as a defender of global partnerships, now risks its image as the fighter? So we are now discussing European sovereignty. And here we have a concrete example of the risks European sovereignty creates. It can antagonize partners, it can create some legal uncertainty, it can create accountability problems for the European Commission, since there is apparently no right forum that can control it fully.
I think you shouldn't be speaking in the present tense. You can already speak in the past tense. The Commission really screwed this up. The damage is already done when it comes to communication, and it was a double whammy. The first one was the export restriction. The second one was the issue relating to the hard border between Ireland and Northern Ireland. They retracted, but now they have an uphill battle to try to fix the problem. Listen, with sovereignty and pooling of sovereignty comes different types of aspects, which are linked to responsibility, who takes care of what. And because the system is so complex and network-based, it is extremely complex to find the person or the blame, the finger that you need to point. It's never going to turn out perfect. That's my bottom line. But my argument on the particular vaccine things is along the lines that the negotiated deal originally was good. Now they need to get the rollout right. Sovereignty, in a world where we really live transnationally, beyond the borders, where decisions are made not in a regional, national, or supranational vacuum, where every decision is touched by politics, by civil service, by journalism, by NGOs, by academia, and so on and so forth. I think it's a little bit old-fashioned to talk about black and white sovereignty. Sovereignty has been pooled, and that has been the case for the past 50, 60 years. And believe me, this pace is going to increase as technology evolves.
So we have a lot of different issues here that we touched upon. The question of vaccine strategy and how it feeds into the idea of strengthening the EU also on a global stage. We have the problem of the control over the European Commission that the member states can exercise. And I wondered, Mr. Szymański, looking from the perspective of a capital, how can member states help, maybe would be a good word, the European Commission to achieve its goals?
I think the vaccine incident, I mean this with the possible limitations of international trade of vaccine, is just a small example, maybe very bright, colorful, but example of the problem we will face in a time of crisis of multilateralism. It's impossible to defend multilateralism alone. It's a contradiction in nature. And our partners are not very keen to be very multilateral, and it is nothing new. The stage of the process is quite developed right now, but the process started many years ago. So when we, as Europe, are starting talking about sovereignty, it's natural reaction. Because when you see the pharmaceutical strategy or industrial strategy, this way of thinking of shortening the trade lanes, the trade independence, about the way how to defend our own interests, especially in crisis situation. But of course we know that after crisis the whole solutions will stay with us. It's nothing unnatural. Of course, I believe that sovereignty is a central notion also for international relations, not to limit international cooperation, because it's impossible and wouldn't be wise, but to make a clear picture who is responsible for what and why we are doing something. And that's why I'm ready and I'm happy to continue this discussion about sovereignty, European sovereignty, but it's pretty clear that we have different sort of understanding of this. For some member states, European sovereignty is just a pretext for protectionism and just a pretext to cut cooperation in wider a Western perspective or transatlantic perspective. Nothing new, but the cover is new. It wouldn't be good because it is probably the worst time ever to cut cooperation when our different partners at the world stage are coming with quite competitive, to put it mildly, approach to Europe. So I'm surprised because we used to believe that sovereignty is strengthened by the international cooperation. In the EU, we used to think that, come on, sovereignty is fine, it's even stronger because we shared sovereignty and now we are stronger in the end, especially for smaller economies, it is absolutely right. But in the same time, probably the same persons would say that sovereignty means that we have to limit our cooperation with the rest of the world. I mean, our world, the Western world. This is something wrong. It is misleading understanding of sovereignty. But sovereignty is and will be a central point because this is the only way how to address the problem of legitimacy. And this is a central point for the EU itself, the legitimacy. Who is responsible for decision, why decision is like this, who is that person in the end at the top leadership level of the EU. So legitimacy, without legitimacy we can't solve the problem of the future of the EU.
But there is the formal legitimacy, but then this is something that Mr. Stubb mentioned, there is the question of practical, let's say, responsibility, where it's the European Commission that gets the blame if things go wrong, but it's the member states, and if things go right, it's the member states that have been successful. So there is also the question of whether legitimacy itself is not being instrumentalized in this discussion about the division of power and
I think the whole political debate is instrumentalized to some degree because this is the competition for merit. And sometimes this competition isn't very fair. And EU and European Commission and the rest should understand it because they normally come from the national politics where this sort of sport is an everyday practice. Mm.
Mr. Stubb, you spoke quite critically of the notion of sovereignty and the way it's being used, but it's also cannot be denied that now it is becoming more and more mainstream. As Mr. Szymański said, in the aftermath of Brexit, given the changes in geopolitics, we are discussing European sovereignty more and more. So we have this word. What do we do with it once it's here?
Yeah, I mean, the first one is to be clear about the terminology. I think the catchword that you might be referring to has two different, not meanings, but connotations. One is strategic sovereignty, and the other one is strategic autonomy. It's pretty much a catchphrase that was introduced in various quarters, not least in France, with the basic idea, as Konrad was probably alluding to, linked to security and in that particular case, NATO. So the idea was that, Europe has come of age. We need to take more responsibility about our security. The danger lies in the fact that some people want to use strategic sovereignty or strategic autonomy as a scapegoat for protectionism. So it's a little bit almost like, America first becomes Europe first. And this is what we need to be really careful about. So when you talk about sovereignty and pooling sovereignty, it's always a balance. I fully agree with the idea that we're also in competition, quote, competition for merit. But this happens on the regional level versus the national level as much as it happens on the national level versus the European level. At the end of the day, is the question in democratic societies is who gets the credit and for what. This is pretty much the debate that we're engaged in. I'll make a final point on this. I think that strategic autonomy would have been easier for Europe if Donald Trump had been elected as president of the United States, because then we could have said, for instance, in our relations with Iran or in our relations with China, that, hey, Trump, he's a loose cannon. It's very difficult for us to follow suit. Now that we have Biden, the situation is completely different. We will pool our strategic sovereignty together with the country that guarantees the security in Europe, namely the United States. A final point. Isn't it sometimes interesting that the countries who are most adamant about speaking about sovereignty back home are the ones who are also most adamant to share that sovereignty with the United States? What I'm trying to say is that politics is not always A, fair, B, logical.
But let's try to put it in practical terms. What do we mean? Because that's definitely true that we have a different meaning of sovereignty in different capitals. For some, it's just a pretext for protectionism. For some, it's just a pretext for strategic change at the expense of transatlantic ties, and so on. For me, European sovereignty means a proper and effective establishment of standards in a new economy, in data protection, which reflects our way of thinking about individual versus corporation, individual versus state or organization. For me, the European sovereignty is also effective establishment of standards on chemical security long days ago, and export it effectively to the world, the rest of the world, which is good for Europe. It is also a question of cooperation with the US, not competition in security. So it is not always about a limitation of thinking about ourselves. It's sometimes about just opposite, wider cooperation. Everything what would help us to strengthen our sovereignty, our objectivity at the world stage, is good for our sovereignty. So I think we should be a little bit more practical, and then we would understand where we are in this meta-political discussion about sovereignty or strategic autonomy. Because it's pretty clear that we are talking about many different things at the same time. Not exactly with Alex, but with others.
Yeah, so there are also those who would advocate for substituting this idea of sovereignty with agility and more adaptability of the European Union and taking control of itself and really projecting power. So I'm very happy that we'll be in another segment. We are talking with Anu Bradford, who's the author of The Brussels Effect book that precisely discusses how European Union projects its power. So maybe a final question, and this is circulating a little bit back to the discussion we had about at the beginning about the changes in European Union and perhaps the need for treaty change or rebalancing of the power between different institutions. So Mr. Szymański, you mentioned that the Polish government would like to see some kind of change of the treaty happening. Where would you see this need for adjustment, in particular in this area of institutional change?
There is no single answer for the institutional character of the Union because it's hybrid and it is community oriented in some aspects like trade or common market, and probably there is no alternative to community-based approach in things like this, or custom union. It's pretty clear, and there are some other sectors, areas where we need more intergovernmental legitimization of the process. In time like this, in time of unpredictability, I think we need much more responsibility of the governments and ownership of the governments for the future of the Union, because otherwise the process will detach and will be very easy target to blame for all mishappenings in the nearest future. I said that we are ready to talk about treaty, but in the same time, we are pretty sure that treaty change isn't possible because any ratification or referendum in not two or three, but rather 6 or 8 countries would fail. And this is a warning because if it's true, it means that the process is in crisis. We have to rebuild, revive the attractiveness of this process, not only for member states, but also for the people. And I see a chance for the future only in a proper community of democracies. I would stress the plural. EU is a community of democracies, a national democracies which expressed and legitimize an attitude toward this or that policy, this or that decision, this or that standpoint at international stage. Of course, it limits the scale of activity of the Union, but I think it is wise to limit ourselves, because if you promise too much, you can be blamed unproportionally for any failure. So beware what you promise. This is my advice for the Union of the next 2-3 years.
And can the Union do this within the existing treaty framework, or are we a little bit trapped?
I hope we can agree that we are quite successful in doing this with current treaty, but of course I understand the logic of criticism, and probably the critics are right to say that this system is a system which is an interpretation of the treaty. It is not a literal understanding of the treaty, because I remember the time when Lisbon was adopted, and many admirers of this treaty said that this is an enormous step, a leap toward more federal approach. Of course, in practice it is not true, because we, in place of community method, we have rather a union method, which is based on hybrid approach to all aspects of policy in the EU, community versus European Council, with our competence of giving a guidance, which is quite controversial today. What does it mean, guidance? For European Parliament, our guidance are a little bit too much intrusive and even legislative for some, and it's an open question what it is.
Mr. Stubb, would you like to, what's your perspective on the desirability but also feasibility of treaty change? So is the conference on the future of Europe going to get us anywhere?
Yeah, sure. Perhaps I should qualify my answer by telling you that I'm a born and bred institutional nerd. In other words, as a civil servant, I was engaged in the Finnish negotiating team, preparing first the Amsterdam Treaty, and then the Nice Treaty, and then I worked for Romana Prodi in the European Commission when we were working in the Convention on the Future of the European Union, which eventually established the European Constitution, which was then voted down in the Netherlands and France, if I recall correctly. And finally, I was back in the Finnish team as a civil servant negotiating the Lisbon Treaty. So very much, for the first 20 years of my European career, I was either preparing, negotiating, or ratifying a new treaty. So to say that I have a little bit of an, how would I say, exhaustion or indigestion about treaty change is an understatement. You asked whether it's desirable or feasible. I am not 100% sure that it's desirable at the moment. I am 100% sure that it's not feasible at the moment. Listen, if we're not able to begin a congress or a conference on the future of Europe to decide on who is going to chair it, let alone what it is going to discuss, I think the uphill battle for trying then to push through treaty change is going to be virtually impossible. Much like Konrad, it is not going to fly in the set referenda or some of the countries. So let's be realistic about this. The European Union advances through crisis, and sometimes, most of the time, you don't need treaty change for that. For instance, the changes that we did in the middle of the euro crisis by establishing a European stability mechanism, by establishing a banking union, those steps would never, ever have taken place in a treaty change context. The same thing is going to go with the pandemic. We would have never prepared stuff that we're going to do in fighting this pandemic in a treaty. So let's just be a little bit American about it and amend our treaties very rarely.
Okay, maybe that's a perfect ending as well, to recognize that there is flexibility within the European Union to deal with the new challenges that come towards it every day now, it appears. Thank you so much for this really interesting discussion. I very much enjoyed it. I hope you did as well as our listeners and spectators on the other side of the screen. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Dziękuję bardzo.